Raphael Redfeather had survived the massacre at Copper Canyon by playing dead among his slaughtered Apache brothers. But nothing could have prepared him for finding a desperate Italian bride using her own body as a shield to protect 3 starving children from wolves in the middle of nowhere. The scream still echoed in Raphael's ears as his stolen cavalry horse thundered across the New Mexico Badlands. Behind him, smoke from the burning Apache camp painted the dawn sky black, and the metallic taste of blood lingered in his mouth, from where he'd bitten his tongue to keep from crying out when Lieutenant Colonel Harrison's men had executed his wounded brothers one by one. 3 days ago, Raphael Redfeather had been known as Scout Sergeant Rafael Santos to the U.S. Army, a man who walked between 2 worlds with the skill of someone born to neither. His Apache mother had named him Redfeather for the crimson hawk feather she'd found the day he was born, and his Mexican father had given him the Christian name Raphael before disappearing back across the border when the boy was 5. For 12 years, he'd served as a translator and guide for the army, believing he was helping to broker peace between his mother's people and the expanding American frontier. But 3 days ago, he'd learned the truth about the peace negotiations he'd been facilitating, hidden behind supply wagons during what was supposed to be a treaty meeting. He'd overheard Colonel Harrison laughing with his officers about how they'd use the gathering to wipe out Chief Running Bear's band entirely. "Every last Apache devil," Harrison had said, spitting tobacco juice into the dirt, "down to the nursing babies. Then we'll blame it on Mexican bandits and claim the land for proper Christian settlers." Raphael had tried to warn his mother's people, but it was too late. The attack came at dawn, when the Apache were preparing for the treaty ceremony, their weapons laid aside as a gesture of good faith. Raphael watched from the rocks above as soldiers slaughtered men, women, and children with systematic brutality. He saw his cousin Standing Wolf cut down while trying to protect his pregnant wife. He watched his childhood friend Little Hawk die with a prayer song on his lips, when a bullet grazed Raphael's head and he tumbled down the rocky slope into the camp. Survival instinct took over. He lay motionless among the bodies, feeling warm blood from the scalp wound run down his face while soldiers walked among the dead, putting extra bullets into anyone who moved. For 6 hours he remained perfectly still, breathing shallowly while flies gathered on the corpses around him, and the desert sun baked the blood into the earth. As darkness fell and the soldiers finally rode away to celebrate their victory, Raphael crawled out from beneath his cousin's body and saw the true scope of the massacre. 47 Apache men, women, and children lay scattered across the camp like broken dolls. The soldiers had taken scalps as trophies and burned the teepees, with the bodies still inside. They'd even killed the horses and dogs, leaving nothing alive except the vultures already circling overhead. Raphael knew he couldn't stay. Harrison's men would return to make sure no witnesses survived, and they'd hang him as a deserter and traitor if they found him alive. So he'd taken a cavalry horse from the soldiers' picketed mounts, gathered what supplies he could find, and ridden into the vast emptiness of the New Mexico territory with nowhere to go and no one left to trust. For 2 days, he'd ridden southeast toward the Mexican border, staying off main trails and avoiding settlements where his mixed appearance might draw attention. His Apache features marked him as a potential threat to white settlers, while his army-issued clothes and equipment made him a target for Mexican bandits and Apache war parties who'd assume he was a deserter or spy. He was a man without a tribe, without a country, without anywhere to call home. On the 3rd morning, as his stolen horse picked its way down a rocky arroyo toward what might be water, Raphael heard something that made him rein up short. Voices carrying on the desert wind, high and frightened. Children's voices speaking what sounded like Italian mixed with broken English. and underneath their words, a deeper sound that made his blood run cold. The distinctive growling of a wolf pack that had found prey. Raphael urged his horse toward the sounds, following a dry creek bed around a massive red sandstone formation. What he saw when he crested the ridge made him forget his own troubles instantly. A young woman in a torn wedding dress knelt in the center of a rocky clearing. Her arms spread wide to shield 3 small children huddled behind her. Her dark hair had escaped its wedding pins and hung in tangled waves around her shoulders, and her white dress was stained with dirt, blood, and what looked like days of desperate travel. But it was her eyes that struck Raphael most forcefully. They blazed with a fierce, protective fury that reminded him of a cornered mountain cat, beautiful and deadly in equal measure. The children behind her couldn't have been more than 8, 6, and 4 years old. 2 boys and a girl, all with the same dark hair and large brown eyes that marked them as her siblings, or perhaps cousins. They were thin to the point of starvation, their clothes hanging loose on their small frames, but they pressed close to their protector with absolute trust. The youngest, a little girl with enormous eyes, clutched a cornhusk doll that was missing half its stuffing. Surrounding them in a loose circle were 5 wolves, their grey coats dusty from the desert and their yellow eyes fixed on the easy prey before them. These weren't the lean coyotes that usually hunted the Badlands, but true wolves, probably driven down from the mountains by drought and hunger. The pack leader, a massive male with scars across his muzzle, paced back and forth just outside striking distance, testing the woman's resolve. The woman held a broken wagon wheel, spoke in her hands like a club, and scattered around her were rocks she'd obviously been throwing to keep the wolves at bay. But Raphael could see she was at the end of her strength. Her hands shook with exhaustion, and her voice was hoarse as she spoke to the children in rapid Italian, probably words of comfort or prayers. She'd clearly been fighting this battle for hours, maybe longer. Raphael didn't hesitate. He spurred his horse down the slope and drew the cavalry colt from his holster, letting out a wild Apache war cry that echoed off the canyon walls. The sound made the wolves' ears flatten and their hackles rise, but it was the sight of a mounted warrior that finally broke their resolve. The pack leader snarled once, then bounded away with his followers, melting into the rocks like grey ghosts. The woman spun toward him as he approached, raising her makeshift weapon defensively. For a moment, Raphael thought she might try to fight him too, her protective instinct so strong that she couldn't immediately recognize friend from foe. But then her eyes took in his face, his mixed features that clearly marked him as something other than a typical cavalry soldier, and her stance shifted slightly. "Please," she said in heavily accented English, her voice cracking with thirst and exhaustion. "The children, they have done nothing wrong. If you must take someone, take me, but let them go. They are just babies." Raphael raised his hands slowly, keeping them visible as he dismounted. He'd learned over the years that his Apache features often frightened white settlers, and this woman had clearly been through enough terror for one day. "I'm not here to hurt anyone," he said in English, then repeated it in Spanish, hoping she might understand one or the other better. "The wolves are gone. You're safe now." The relief that flooded her face was so profound that Raphael thought she might collapse. Her knees buckled slightly, and the oldest boy, probably 8 years old, wrapped his thin arms around her waist to steady her. "Ingrid," the boy whispered in English. "He scared the bad dogs away." Ingrid. So that was her name. Raphael looked more closely at her torn wedding dress, at the delicate lace that spoke of careful preparation, at the small bouquet of wilted desert flowers still pinned to her bodice. This was a bride who'd never made it to her wedding, or who'd fled from it under circumstances that had left her alone in the wilderness with 3 children to protect. "When did you last eat?" Raphael asked gently, noting the hollow cheeks and the way the children leaned against each other for support. "When did you last have water?" Ingrid's attempt to answer dissolved into a coughing fit that shook her whole body. The youngest child, the little girl with the doll, started to cry. "Do it, Johnny," Ingrid finally managed. 2 days. Maybe 3. I lose track. Raphael moved to his horse and pulled down his water skin and the small bag of hardtack and jerky he'd taken from the cavalry supplies. It wasn't much, but it would keep them alive. He knelt down and offered the water to the youngest child first, watching as Ingrid's eyes filled with tears of gratitude. "What are your names?" he asked as the children shared the water, each taking careful sips under Ingrid's watchful eye. The discipline they showed, waiting their turns despite their obvious thirst, spoke of good raising and desperate circumstances. "I'm Ingrid Marchetti," the woman said, her voice stronger now that she'd had water. "These are my children now. Paolo, he is 8, Marco 6, and little Lucia, she is 4. She smoothed the little girl's hair with gentle fingers. Their parents, they died in the crossing. I promised I would care for them like my own." The crossing. Raphael understood now. These were immigrants, probably part of one of the wagon trains that brought European families west in search of farmland and new lives. Something had gone wrong, terribly wrong, leaving this young woman alone with 3 orphaned children in the middle of the most unforgiving territory in North America. "Where were you heading?" Raphael asked as he shared out small pieces of jerky, showing the children how to let it soften in their mouths to make it easier to chew. "What happened to your wagon train?" Ingrid's face darkened with pain and anger. "We were going to Silver Creek in Arizona Territory. I was to marry a man there, Cornelius Blackwood. He owns land, cattle. My father in Chicago, he arranged it. The marriage would provide for the children, give them a proper home." She paused, looking down at her torn wedding dress with bitter laughter. "But when we arrived yesterday, I discovered what kind of man Cornelius Blackwood really is, what he expected from a wife, what he planned to do with children who were not his blood." Raphael felt his jaw tighten. He'd heard stories about mail-order brides, about the men who advertised for wives in Eastern newspapers and what some of them expected when those women arrived. What did he do? Oh, he said the children would work his mines until they were old enough to be useful, then he would sell their contracts to other mine owners. He said I would give him sons, and any daughters would be married off as soon as they bled. He said I belonged to him now, to do with as he pleased. The oldest boy, Paolo, spoke up in broken English. The bad man, he hit Ingrid when she said no. He locked us in a room. But Ingrid, she is smart. She got us out. Ingrid nodded, unconsciously touching her left cheek, where Raphael could now see the faded outline of a bruise. "I waited until he was drunk, then I took the children and some supplies and ran. I thought we could reach the next town, find help. But we got lost in the desert, and then the wagon broke, and then the wolves came." She looked up at Raphael with eyes that held both gratitude and wariness. "You saved our lives. But I do not know what to do now. We have nowhere to go, no money, no family. Cornelius will be looking for us. He said I was his property now, bought and paid for." Raphael felt something cold and hard settle in his chest. He'd just escaped from one form of slavery and murder, only to find this woman and these children trapped in another. The parallels weren't lost on him. Cornelius Blackwood sounded like the kind of man who'd get along well with Colonel Harrison, both of them treating human beings as disposable property. "How far is Silver Creek from here?" he asked, already planning. If this Blackwood was everything Ingrid said he was, then he'd definitely send men after her. A man who thought he owned a woman wouldn't let her escape without a fight, maybe 20 miles north, Ingrid said. But he has men, vaqueros, who work his ranch. They know this country. If they find us—" She didn't finish the sentence, but she didn't need to. Raphael could imagine what would happen to a runaway bride and 3 orphaned children who'd inconvenienced a powerful man. "It wouldn't be pretty. Then we don't let them find us," Raphael said simply. He stood and walked to his horse, checking the saddle and the supplies. "Can you ride?" Ingrid blinked in surprise. "You would help us? But you don't know us. We are strangers, and I have nothing to pay you with." Raphael looked back at her, at this brave woman who'd risked everything to protect 3 children who weren't even her own blood, and felt something shift inside his chest. For 3 days, he'd been running from death and betrayal, carrying nothing but anger and the bitter taste of loss. But here was something he could actually do something about. Here was a fight worth having. "Lady," he said, using the gentle tone his Apache mother had taught him for speaking to women and children. "3 days ago, I watched innocent people get murdered by men who thought they had the right to decide who lived and who died. I'm not about to let it happen again." He helped Ingrid and the children onto his horse, settling little Lucia in front of him where she could hold onto the saddle horn, with Paolo and Marco riding double behind Ingrid. It would be slow going with so much weight, but his cavalry mount was strong and used to long distances. "Where are we going?" Ingrid asked as Raphael led the horse away from the clearing where the wolves had almost won their deadly game. "South," Raphael said. "Away from Silver Creek, away from Colonel Harrison's patrol routes, away from men who think they own other people." He paused, looking up at her. "There's a place I know down near the Mexican border, a town called Esperanza. They don't ask too many questions there, and they don't much like bullies." As they started down the rocky trail that would take them deeper into the Badlands, Raphael found himself thinking about the strange turns life could take. This morning he'd been a man without purpose, running from death with nowhere to go. Now he was responsible for 4 lives, heading toward an uncertain future with a woman whose courage reminded him why some things were worth fighting for. Behind them, the desert wind erased their tracks. But Raphael knew it wouldn't be long before Cornelius Blackwood's men found their trail. The real danger was just beginning, and the choices they made in the next few days would determine whether this story ended in freedom or tragedy. The thundering hoofbeats reached them before dawn, echoing off the canyon walls like war drums. And Raphael knew that Cornelius Blackwood's hunting party had found their trail faster than he'd hoped. Raphael had pushed them hard through the night, following game trails and dry creek beds that would mask their passage. But the cavalry horse was carrying too much weight and leaving too clear a track. By moonlight, he'd found a narrow cave hidden behind a curtain of desert willow, just large enough to shelter them and the horse until sunrise. But now, as grey light crept across the Badlands, the sound of pursuit was growing closer. Ingrid stirred against his shoulder where she'd been sleeping fitfully. The 3 children curled around her like puppies seeking warmth. Little Lucia had cried herself to sleep, clutching her corn-husk doll, while Paolo and Marco had taken turns staying awake to watch for dangers, their young faces grave with responsibilities no child should bear. The sight of them had reminded Raphael of Apache children he'd known, forced to grow up too fast in a world that showed no mercy to the innocent. "How many?" Ingrid whispered, instantly alert despite her exhaustion. Raphael noted approvingly that she didn't waste time with questions about whether the riders were friendly. She'd learned to trust his instincts about danger. Raphael crept to the cave mouth and listened to the rhythm of the hoofbeats, counting the different gates and the spacing between horses. 6 riders, he said quietly, moving fast but not reckless. "They're following our trail, not searching randomly. Someone in that group knows how to track." Paolo sat up, his young face tight with fear. "Is it the bad man? Is he coming for us?" Raphael moved back to where the children huddled together, noting how they instinctively positioned themselves between Ingrid and any potential threat. These weren't pampered city children. They'd learned harsh lessons about the world during their journey west, lessons that might keep them alive in the days ahead. "Maybe," Raphael said honestly. He'd learned from his Apache relatives that children could handle more truth than most adults believed, and lies told to protect them often got them killed. "But we're not going to let him take you. Any of you." Ingrid met his eyes across the dim cave, and Raphael saw something there that made his chest tighten. Trust. Complete, absolute faith that he would keep his word, even though she barely knew him. It was a heavy responsibility, heavier than any burden he'd carried as an army scout. The hoofbeats were close enough now that Raphael could hear the creak of leather and the jingle of spurs. He motioned for silence and drew his Colt, checking the cylinder by touch. 6 shots. Against 6 men if it came to a fight. Not good odds, especially with 4 lives depending on him. But as the riders passed their hiding place, Raphael caught fragments of conversation that made his blood run cold. These weren't just Blackwood's ranch hands looking for a runaway bride. These were professional manhunters, and they were discussing a bounty that had nothing to do with a broken marriage contract. "Colonel says the breed scout knows about Copper Canyon," one voice drifted back. "Can't let him reach the territorial marshal with that kind of information. Bad for business." Another voice, rougher and more gravelly. "Blackwood just wants his woman back, but the colonel's paying double for the half-breed's scalp. Says make it look like Apaches did it." Raphael felt ice form in his veins. Colonel Harrison hadn't just murdered Chief Running Bear's band. He was actively hunting down witnesses, and somehow he'd connected Raphael's escape to Blackwood's missing bride. The 2 men were working together, which meant Ingrid and the children weren't just running from an abusive husband. They were caught in the middle of a military cover-up that would get them all killed. The riders continued past the cave, but Raphael knew they'd be back. Professional trackers would spot the signs where he'd led the horse off the main trail, and it wouldn't take them long to find the cave. They had maybe an hour before the hunters returned with a plan. "We have to move," Raphael said quietly. "Now. But first, I need to tell you something about the men hunting us." As they prepared to leave the cave, Raphael explained what he'd overheard, watching Ingrid's face pale as she understood the true scope of their danger. These weren't just running from Blackwood's wounded pride. They were witnesses to crimes that powerful men would kill to keep secret. "So we cannot go to the law," Ingrid said, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. "They are part of this conspiracy." "Some of them, maybe," Raphael agreed. "But not all. There are good men in the territorial government, honest judges and marshals. The problem is reaching them alive." He helped the children onto the horse, arranging them so that Paolo could hold the reins while he and Ingrid walked alongside. They couldn't outrun mounted pursuit, but they might be able to outwit it. The desert was full of places to hide for someone who knew its secrets. As they left the cave, Raphael led them deeper into the maze of canyons and arroyos that cut through the Badlands like a giant's claw marks. This was country he'd scouted during his army service, land so harsh and confusing that even experienced guides could get lost for days. If he could reach the hidden spring at Devil's Backbone, they might have a chance. But Blackwood's men were better than he'd hoped. By mid-morning, dust clouds on the horizon showed that the hunters had split up, sending riders to block the most obvious escape routes while others followed their trail directly. Raphael began to understand why Cornelius Blackwood had become wealthy in this unforgiving country. He hired competent help. "Paolo," Raphael said as they paused in the shade of a red rock overhang. "You're the oldest. I need you to listen carefully to what I'm about to tell you." The boy straightened his shoulders, trying to look older than his 8 years. Raphael recognized the gesture. He'd done the same thing at that age, when Apache raiders had killed his Mexican father and left him to help his mother survive in 2 worlds that both rejected them. "If something happens to me," Raphael continued, "if the bad men catch up and we get separated, you take your brother and sister and you follow the sun south. Keep the mountains on your left hand. Walk at night when it's cool. Hide during the day. In 3 days, maybe 4, you'll reach a river. Follow it west until you find a town called Esperanza." Paolo nodded solemnly, filing away every word. "What do we tell the people there?" "You tell them Raphael Redfeather sent you. You tell them you need to find Father Miguel at the mission. He'll take care of you until we can come for you." Ingrid's sharp intake of breath told Raphael she understood what he was really saying. He was preparing the children for the possibility that neither of the adults would survive what was coming. It was a conversation no child should have to hear, but the desert didn't care about what children should or shouldn't have to endure. As the sun climbed higher and the heat became crushing, Raphael led them through increasingly difficult terrain, hoping to slow their pursuers and maybe force some of the horses to go lame on the sharp rocks. But the dust clouds kept getting closer, and he could see that the hunters were closing in from 3 directions. That's when they heard the gunshots. The shots came from the north, where one of the search parties had been heading. Not the measured crack of target practice, but the rapid fire of a desperate fight. Raphael counted at least 20 shots in the first exchange, then an ominous silence. "What does it mean?" Ingrid asked, unconsciously gathering the children closer. Raphael wasn't sure, but he had a sick feeling in his stomach. There were other people in these Badlands, people who might have stumbled into the manhunt by accident. Prospectors, maybe, or travelers who'd taken the wrong trail. If Blackwood's men were willing to kill witnesses to keep their secret safe, the answer came an hour later when they crested a ridge and saw smoke rising from the valley below. Through Raphael's small brass telescope, he could make out the remains of a freight wagon and what looked like 3 bodies sprawled in the sand. Vultures were already circling. "Dear God," Ingrid whispered when Raphael described what he'd seen. "They killed innocent people, just for being in the wrong place." Raphael felt the cold rage building in his chest, the same fury that had sustained him through 3 days of running and hiding. These men weren't just criminals. They were monsters who killed for convenience, who saw other human beings as obstacles to be removed. They were no different from the soldiers who'd massacred Chief Running Bear's camp. But rage wouldn't keep Ingrid and the children alive. He needed to think, to plan, to use every skill his Apache mother and his army training had taught him. The hunters were closing in, but they'd also just made a mistake. They'd revealed how far they were willing to go, which meant Raphael no longer had to hold back. "There's a place ahead called the Devil's Backbone," Raphael said, as they started down the backside of the ridge, staying low to avoid being silhouetted against the sky. "It's a narrow pass between 2 cliff faces. Very dangerous, very easy to defend. You want to make a stand there," Ingrid said. "It wasn't a question. I want to make them think we're making a stand there," Raphael corrected, "while we slip away through a path they don't know exists." The Devil's Backbone was a geological formation that looked like the spine of some enormous buried creature, with towering red cliffs on both sides and a narrow passage barely wide enough for a horse and rider. Local legends said it was haunted by the spirits of Apache warriors who died defending it from Spanish conquistadors. But Raphael knew the real danger came from rockfalls and flash floods, not ghosts. As they approached the pass, Raphael explained his plan. They would leave obvious signs of their passage into the Devil's Backbone, including some of their remaining food and Ingrid's torn petticoat to make it look like they were preparing for a siege. But while Blackwood's men were positioning themselves to attack the pass, Raphael would lead them through a hidden trail that his Apache cousins had shown him years ago. "It's dangerous," he warned. "The path is narrow, crumbling in places. One wrong step and it's a 100-foot drop. But it comes out 5 miles south of here, and by the time they realize we're gone, we'll have hours of head start." Ingrid looked at the children, measuring their strength and courage against the risks ahead. Paolo and Marco were tough for their ages, seasoned by hard travel and harder losses. But little Lucia was only 4, exhausted and traumatized. Could she make a journey that would challenge grown men? "We do it," Ingrid said finally. "Whatever the risk, it's better than letting those animals catch us." As the sun reached its zenith and the Badlands shimmered with heat waves, Raphael put his plan into motion. He led the horse into the Devil's Backbone, making sure their tracks were clear and obvious. He broke branches at the right height to suggest they'd pass through quickly. He even fired 2 shots into the air, letting the sound echo off the canyon walls to draw the hunters' attention. Then, while the echoes were still fading, he led Ingrid and the children to a crack in the southern cliff face that looked like nothing more than a shadow. The hidden path was there, just as he remembered it, barely 2 feet wide and invisible from more than a few yards away. "Paolo," Raphael said, kneeling down to look the boy in the eyes. "You're going to lead your brother and sister up this path. Stay close to the wall, don't look down, don't go fast. I'll be right behind you with the horse. What about Ingrid?" Paolo asked. "I'll bring her too," Raphael promised. "But you're responsible for Marco and Lucia now. Can you do that?" The boy nodded gravely, understanding that he was being given a man's responsibility. He took his little sister's hand in one of his and his brother's in the other, and started up the treacherous path with the steady determination of someone much older. Raphael helped Ingrid onto the horse, then began the delicate work of leading the animal up a trail that had never been meant for anything larger than a mountain goat. One wrong step would send them all plunging to their deaths, but it was still safer than facing 6 professional killers in a straight fight. Halfway up the cliff face, they heard the hunters arrive at the Devil's Backbone below. Shouts echoed off the canyon walls as the men positioned themselves to storm the pass, expecting to find their quarry trapped like rats in a cage. Raphael allowed himself a grim smile as he listened to them argue about the best approach, but the smile faded when he heard a new voice join the discussion below, a voice he recognized from 3 nights of nightmares, cold and cultured and completely without mercy. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Colonel Harrison had joined the hunt personally, and Raphael knew that changed everything. Harrison wasn't just another corrupt officer looking to cover up a massacre. He was a man who'd built his career on the systematic extermination of anyone who stood in his way. He wouldn't make the mistakes that ordinary hunters might make. "He's here," Raphael whispered to Ingrid as they continued climbing the hidden path. "The man who killed my people? He's down there." Ingrid's hand found his arm, her touch steadying him when the rage threatened to overwhelm his judgment. "Then we make sure he doesn't get the chance to kill anymore," she said quietly. "We survive, we reach safety, and we tell the world what he did." As they neared the top of the cliff, little Lucia stumbled and nearly fell. Only Paolo's quick reflexes saved her from plunging into the abyss. The incident reminded Raphael how precarious their situation remained. They might have escaped the immediate trap, but they were still hours away from safety, and their pursuers wouldn't be fooled for long. The hidden path led to a maze of stone pillars and natural arches that provided perfect cover for their escape. But as they emerged from the cliff face, Raphael saw something that made his heart sink. Dust clouds on the eastern horizon, moving fast and heading straight for their position. Somehow, Harrison had anticipated the ruse. While his men stormed the empty Devil's Backbone, he'd sent riders to cut off the most likely escape routes. The colonel knew this country better than Raphael had given him credit for, and now they were caught between the hunters behind them and fresh enemies ahead. "Raphael," Ingrid said quietly, "there's something I haven't told you about my time with Cornelius Blackwood, something that might help us now." She reached into her torn wedding dress and pulled out a small leather pouch that had been hidden against her corset. Inside were gold coins, more than Raphael had ever seen in one place. "Blackwood bragged about his business arrangements," she said, "about the payments he received for providing supplies to certain army units. Units that were supposed to be fighting Apaches but were actually murdering them," Raphael finished, understanding immediately. The gold wasn't just Blackwood's payment for a bride. It was evidence of a conspiracy that reached much higher than one corrupt colonel and one brutal rancher. As the enemy riders approached from the east and the sounds of pursuit grew louder from the Devil's Backbone behind them, Raphael realized they were no longer just running for their lives. They were carrying proof of crimes that could bring down powerful men throughout the territory. But first, they had to survive the next hour, and with enemies closing in from 2 directions, their options were running out fast. The Apache war paint streaked across Raphael's face in the ancient patterns his mother had taught him. But the riders approaching from 3 directions had no idea they were about to face a warrior who'd learned to fight dirty from both sides of a blood-soaked frontier. Raphael had found the war paint in a leather pouch tucked inside his shirt, carried from the massacre at Copper Canyon as the last remnant of his mother's people. As he smeared the red and black pigments across his cheeks in the traditional pattern of the Red Feather clan, he felt something shift inside him. For 3 days he'd been running, thinking, planning like the civilized scout the army had trained him to be. But civilization hadn't saved Chief Running Bear's people, And it wouldn't save Ingrid and the children. What are you doing? Ingrid whispered as Raphael transformed himself into something that looked like it had stepped out of a settler's worst nightmare. The children watched with wide eyes as he stripped off his cavalry shirt and boots, keeping only his weapons and the breechcloth that marked him as Apache. Giving them what they expect to see, Raphael said grimly, and using their fears against them. The maze of stone pillars where they'd taken shelter offered perfect cover but limited escape routes. The hunters approaching from the east numbered 4 men, while the sounds from Devil's Backbone suggested that Harrison's main force was still trying to figure out how they'd vanished from the pass. That gave Raphael an advantage, but only if he could exploit it quickly. He studied the approaching riders through his telescope, noting their formation and equipment. These weren't Blackwood's regular ranch hands. They carried military-issue carbines and rode with the discipline of cavalry troopers, but their uniforms were a mix of army surplus and civilian clothes that marked them as something unofficial. Mercenaries probably hired for jobs too dirty for regular soldiers. "Paolo," Raphael said, calling the boy over while keeping his voice low. "Remember what I told you about following the sun south? If things go wrong here, you take Marco and Lucia and you run. Don't look back, don't wait for us, just run." The 8-year-old nodded solemnly, but his young face was troubled. "What about you and Ingrid? What about the bad men?" Raphael touched the boy's shoulder gently, noting how Paolo tried not to flinch at the sight of the war paint. "Some fights are worth having, even when you can't win them. But your job is to make sure your brother and sister survive, to grow up free. That's more important than anything else." As the mercenaries drew closer, Raphael began implementing a plan that would have made his Apache cousins proud, and his army commanders court-martial him. He positioned Ingrid and the children behind the largest stone pillar, where they could escape through a narrow gap if necessary, then began preparing an ambush that relied on misdirection, terror, and the superstitious fears that haunted white men in Apache country. The first part was simple enough. Raphael climbed to the top of a smaller pillar and let himself be seen briefly, just long enough for the approaching riders to spot what looked like a lone Apache warrior. Then he vanished back into the rocks, moving with the silent grace his mother's people had taught him. The effect was immediate. The mercenaries reined up, suddenly cautious. One of them pulled out field glasses and swept the stone maze, looking for signs of a larger war party. They'd all heard stories about Apache ambushes, about white men who'd ridden confidently into similar terrain and been found days later with arrows in their backs. "Just one redskin," the leader called out, but his voice carried a note of uncertainty. "Probably a scout for a larger band." Raphael smiled grimly as he moved through the shadows between the stone pillars. Let them think that. Fear would make them cautious, and caution would give him the advantage he needed. He'd learned from watching Colonel Harrison's massacre that white men's confidence turned to panic quickly when they realized they weren't fighting helpless victims. The second part of his plan required more finesse, using techniques his Apache cousins had perfected over generations of guerrilla warfare. Raphael began creating the illusion of multiple warriors moving through the rocks. A glimpse of movement here, the flash of steel there, the echo of war cries that seemed to come from all directions. The mercenaries' horses began to nervous dance, sensing their riders' tension. One animal spooked at a sound Raphael made by scraping steel against stone, nearly throwing its rider. The men were bunching together now, abandoning their tactical formation in favor of mutual protection. That's when Raphael struck. His first shot took the leader out of the saddle, the heavy cavalry colt booming like thunder among the stone pillars. Before the echo died away, Raphael was moving, his Apache training allowing him to flow through the shadows like smoke. His second shot dropped another horse, sending its rider scrambling for cover among the rocks. But these weren't green recruits or panicked settlers. As soon as they realized they were under attack, the surviving mercenaries dismounted and began working their way toward Raphael's position with professional competence. They moved in pairs, covering each other as they advanced through the maze of stone. Raphael found himself in the kind of running gun battle that had made the Apache the most feared warriors on the frontier. He used every trick his mother's people had taught him, firing from concealment and moving before return fire could find him, using the echoes among the stone pillars to confuse his enemies about his location. The fight might have continued for hours, with Raphael slowly whittling down the mercenaries' numbers. But then he heard something that changed everything. Hoofbeats approaching fast from the Devil's Backbone, and Colonel Harrison's voice, cutting through the gunfire like a blade. "Spread out and surround them. There's only one Apache, and he's protecting something. Find what he's hiding and kill it." Raphael's blood ran cold as he realized Harrison had figured out the truth. The colonel knew this wasn't a random Apache war party. He'd connected Raphael's presence to the missing bride and children, and now he was bringing his full force to bear from his position among the rocks. Raphael could see Harrison's men flooding into the stone maze. 8 riders, all armed with repeating rifles and moving with military precision. Against 11 men, his guerrilla tactics would only delay the inevitable. That's when Ingrid surprised him. Instead of staying hidden with the children as Raphael had ordered, she appeared at his elbow, carrying the extra ammunition from his saddlebags and the knife he'd given her back at the lighthouse. Her wedding dress was torn and stained, but her eyes blazed with the same protective fury he'd seen when she'd faced down the wolves. "The children are safe," she said, answering his unspoken question. "Paolo knows the escape route, but I'm not leaving you to face this alone." Before Raphael could argue, Ingrid proved that she hadn't spent her journey west sitting helplessly in a wagon. She'd obviously learned to shoot during the crossing, because her first shot with Raphael's backup pistol took one of Harrison's flankers in the shoulder and sent him diving for cover. "My father taught me to hunt rabbits in the mountains behind our village," she said, reloading with practiced efficiency. "These men are bigger targets." For a moment, fighting side by side among the ancient stones, Raphael felt something he hadn't experienced since the massacre at Copper Canyon. Hope, not the desperate hope of survival, but the fierce joy of fighting alongside someone who understood what was worth dying for. But hope wasn't enough against 11 professional killers. Harrison's men were closing in from multiple directions, and Raphael's ammunition was running low. Even with Ingrid's help, they could only hold out for a few more minutes. That's when the real Apache arrived. The war cry that echoed off the stone pillars was like nothing Raphael had heard since childhood. A sound that made his Apache blood sing with recognition and terror. It was followed by the thunder of unshod hooves and the whistle of arrows finding their targets. From the eastern approach came 8 Apache warriors, their ponies painted for war and their faces decorated with the traditional markings of a revenge raid. At their head rode a man Raphael recognized with shock, his cousin Joaquin Stormcloud, who was supposed to be dead in the massacre at Copper Canyon. The effect on Harrison's mercenaries was immediate and devastating. Men who'd been advancing confidently through the rocks suddenly found themselves caught between Raphael's position and a genuine Apache war party. The difference between facing one hidden enemy and 8 mounted warriors was the difference between a calculated risk and a death sentence. Joaquin's first arrow took one of the mercenaries through the throat before the man could raise his rifle. A second warrior, riding low along his pony's neck, swept past another enemy and opened his throat with a war hatchet. In seconds, Harrison's organized advance dissolved into chaos. "Cousin!" Joaquin called out in Apache as he rode past Raphael's position. "We thought you were dead with the others." "Da Kirstun, I thought you were too." Raphael called back, switching to his mother's language as he and Ingrid ran for better cover. "How did you escape?" "No, sir, I was hunting in the high country when the soldiers came," Joaquin replied, his pony dancing as he nocked another arrow. "I found the bodies, followed your trail. You lead us to men who need killing." But Colonel Harrison wasn't finished. Even as his men scattered before the Apache attack, he was rallying them with the cold competence that had made him effective at exterminating native peoples. "Form square," he shouted. "Back to back. Make every shot count." The surviving mercenaries pulled together in a defensive formation that had served the army well in Indian fighting. Surrounded but disciplined, they began picking off Apache ponies with careful rifle fire. The warriors' initial advantage was already fading as the fight turned into a more conventional battle. Raphael realized this was his chance to end the fight decisively. While the two forces engaged each other among the stone pillars, he could work his way around to Harrison's position and settle the debt that had been growing since Copper Canyon. "Stay with Joaquin," he told Ingrid, pressing his spare ammunition into her hands. "Whatever happens, make sure the children reach Esperanza. Make sure someone knows the truth about what Harrison did." But as Raphael began working his way through the rocks toward Harrison's position, he realized the colonel had anticipated him. Instead of staying with his men, Harrison had broken away from the fight and was moving toward the stone pillar where Paulo, Marco, and little Lucia were hidden. The colonel had figured out that the children were Raphael's weak point. If he could take them hostage, he could end the fight without losing any more men. It was a calculating, ruthless move that perfectly illustrated why Harrison had risen to his position despite his brutality. Raphael found himself in a nightmare race through the stone maze, trying to reach the children before Harrison could grab them. Behind him, the battle raged on with Apache war cries, mixing with gunfire and the screams of wounded men. But all of that faded into background noise as Raphael focused on the one thing that mattered, getting to the children first. He almost made it. Raphael reached the stone pillar just as Harrison emerged from the opposite side. His service pistol trained on little Lucia as she huddled behind her makeshift shelter. The 4-year-old looked up at the colonel with enormous eyes, still clutching her corn-husk doll. "Well, well," Harrison said, his cultured voice incongruously calm amid the chaos of battle. "Scout Sergeant Rafael Santos. Or should I say, the Apache traitor who's been causing me so much trouble." Raphael kept his gun pointed at Harrison, but they both knew the situation had shifted. The colonel had his weapon aimed at a child, and Raphael couldn't risk the shot. One wrong move and little Lucia would die. "Let her go," Raphael said quietly. "Your fight is with me, not with innocent children." Harrison laughed, and the sound was like ice cracking. "Innocent? These little savages will grow up to breed more of their kind. Better to end the problem now, before they become a real threat." The casual evil in Harrison's words hit Raphael like a physical blow. This was a man who could order the massacre of an entire Apache camp and see it as pest control. There would be no reasoning with him, no appeal to mercy or conscience. But as Raphael searched for a way to save Lucia without getting her killed, he heard something that made his heart leap. The sound of small feet moving carefully over stone, and Paolo's voice whispering in Italian as he positioned himself behind Harrison with a sharp rock raised over his head. The 8-year-old boy had learned more than just survival during his journey west. He'd learned when to hide and when to fight, and he'd decided that a man threatening his little sister had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. Raphael caught Paolo's eye and gave the slightest nod, then launched himself sideways just as the boy brought the rock down on Harrison's skull with all the force his small body could muster. The colonel staggered, his shot going wide as he spun toward this unexpected attack. That gave Raphael the opening he needed. His bullet took Harrison's center mass, dropping the man who'd ordered the massacre at Copper Canyon and hunted them across the Badlands. But even as Harrison fell, Raphael could hear the battle behind them, turning against the Apache. Joaquin's war cry had taken on a note of desperation, and the sound of gunfire was growing more sporadic. The warriors were running out of arrows, and the disciplined rifle fire of the surviving mercenaries was taking its toll. As Raphael gathered the children and prepared to make their final run for safety, he realized that defeating Harrison was only the beginning. They still had to escape the Badlands, reach civilization, and find someone willing to believe their story about military corruption and mass murder. And they had to do it while carrying evidence that powerful men would kill to keep secret, with enemies still hunting them and allies whose own survival hung by a thread. The mysterious Mexican woman who emerged from the hidden cave entrance spoke perfect English, with a cultured accent that belonged in a Boston drawing room, not a secret rebel hideout beneath the New Mexico desert. And her first words changed everything Raphael thought he knew about their desperate situation. "Senor Redfeather, we have been expecting you," the woman said as she stepped into the fading daylight. Her elegant black dress incongruous against the backdrop of ancient stone and desert scrub. Behind her, the cave mouth Raphael had thought was just another crack in the rocks revealed itself as the entrance to something much larger and more organized. "My name is Dr. Elena Vasquez, and you and your companions are now under the protection of the Esperanza Network." Raphael stared at her in amazement, still breathing hard from their desperate flight from the Stone Maze battle. Joaquin and his surviving Apache warriors had bought them time with their lives, holding off the remaining mercenaries long enough for Raphael to escape with Ingrid and the children, but at a terrible cost. His cousin now lay among the red rocks with 3 arrows in his chest, and only 2 of the original 8 warriors had managed to break away from the fight. "How do you know my name?" Raphael asked, his hand still resting on his gun. After 3 days of betrayal and pursuit, he'd learned to trust no one who claimed to be helping them. Dr. Vasquez smiled, and Raphael was surprised to see genuine warmth in her dark eyes. "Father Miguel sent word 3 days ago that you might be coming this way. He has friends throughout the territory, Senor Redfeather, and they have been watching for a certain Apache scout who helped a bride escape from Cornelius Blackwood." She gestured toward the cave entrance, where Raphael could now see armed men positioned in the shadows. But these weren't the kind of mercenaries who'd been hunting them. These were Mexican vaqueros, Apache warriors, freed slaves, and white men whose faces carried the weathered look of people who'd chosen the hard path of fighting injustice. "The Esperanza Network has been operating in this territory for 5 years. Dr. Vasquez continued as she led them toward the cave. "We help people escape from situations where the law cannot or will not protect them. Runaway slaves heading for Mexico, Apache families fleeing army roundups, women escaping abusive marriages, children sold into labor contracts. People like you." As they entered the cave, Raphael realized they'd stumbled into something extraordinary. What had looked like a simple hideout from outside was actually an elaborate underground complex, with tunnels leading deeper into the mesa and chambers carved out of the living rock. Oil lamps provided warm light, and the air carried the sense of cooking food and medicinal herbs. "This place is ancient," Dr. Vasquez explained, as she led them through passages decorated with petroglyphs that predated the arrival of any European. "The Anasazi built the first chambers 1,000 years ago. Later, Spanish priests used it as a secret mission to protect natives from the Inquisition. During the Mexican period, it sheltered revolutionaries. Now we use it to shelter people from a different kind of oppression." Ingrid walked beside Raphael, with little Lucia in her arms, while Paolo and Marco stayed close to her sides. The children's eyes were wide as they took in the underground wonderland, but Raphael could see the exhaustion in their young faces. They'd been running for their lives for days, and the strain was beginning to tell. "The children need rest," Dr. Vasquez observed, her physician's training evident in how quickly she assessed their condition. "And food, clean water, medical attention for those scrapes and bruises. We have facilities here that can provide all of that." She led them to a chamber that had been converted into a comfortable living space, with sleeping alcoves carved into the walls and a central fire pit that provided both warmth and light. Other refugees were already there, and Raphael was surprised by the diversity of the group that had found sanctuary in this hidden place. There was Maria Santos, a young Mexican woman who'd escaped from a forced marriage to a much older man who'd beaten her. James Crawford, a freed slave from Texas who was making his way to California with his 2 daughters after his wife had been murdered by night riders. Running Deer, an elderly Apache medicine woman who'd survived 3 different army campaigns designed to exterminate her people, but it was the fourth refugee who made Raphael's blood run cold. Thomas Hartley was a former army clerk who discovered that several high-ranking officers were selling weapons to Apache war parties, then using those same weapons as evidence to justify punitive expeditions against peaceful bands. When he tried to report the corruption, his commanding officer had ordered him shot as a deserter. Colonel Harrison was part of it, Hartley said, when Raphael described their pursuit and the battle at the Stone Maze. He was selling rifles to Geronimo's warriors, then claiming he needed more troops and supplies to fight them. It was a perfect system, profitable for everyone except the innocent people who got caught in the middle. Raphael felt pieces of a larger puzzle clicking into place. Harrison hadn't just been covering up the massacre at Copper Canyon. He'd been protecting a much larger conspiracy that reached deep into the territorial government and military command. The colonel's death would slow down his partners, but it wouldn't stop them. That's why the evidence you carry is so dangerous, Dr. Vasquez said, examining the leather pouch of gold coins that Ingrid had taken from Blackwood's safe. This money can be traced back to specific army contracts, specific shipments of weapons. In the right hands, it could bring down a dozen corrupt officials. She held up one of the coins, studying the markings on its edge. But first, we have to get you to someone who can use this evidence properly. Someone with the authority and integrity to prosecute a case this complex. That someone, it turned out, was Judge Samuel Morrison, a territorial judge based in Santa Fe who'd been quietly investigating reports of military corruption for months. But reaching Santa Fe meant a journey of over 200 miles through country crawling with Harrison's allies and Blackwood's hired guns. Cornelius Blackwood is not the kind of man who accepts loss gracefully, Dr. Vasquez warned as they planned the next stage of their escape. He has put a bounty on all of you, dead or alive. $500 for the woman, $300 for you, and $100 each for the children. The casual mention of prices on their heads made Paolo straighten his shoulders and try to look dangerous, while little Lucia clung more tightly to her cornhusk doll. Marco, caught between childhood and the harsh realities they'd been forced to face, just looked tired beyond his 6 years. But the network has ways of moving people safely, Dr. Vasquez continued. We use old Spanish trails, Apache paths, routes that most white men don't know exist. And we have safe houses all along the way, places where you can rest and resupply. The plan she outlined was ambitious and dangerous. They would travel north through the Sangre de Cristo Mountains, staying off main roads and avoiding settlements where bounty hunters might be watching. The journey would take 2 weeks if everything went well, longer if they encountered problems. The children won't make it, Raphael said bluntly. Paolo and Marco are tough, but they're already exhausted. And Lucia is only 4 years old. She can't walk mountain trails for 2 weeks. Dr. Vasquez nodded thoughtfully. Which is why you won't be walking. We have arranged for special transportation. The special transportation turned out to be a solution so audacious that Raphael had to admire its sheer boldness. A traveling medicine show was currently making its way north through the territory, complete with wagons, performers, and enough legitimate chaos to hide a few extra passengers. Professor Cornelius Maximilian's traveling emporium of medical miracles and scientific wonders, Dr. Vasquez said, with a slight smile. The professor is actually Dr. Jeremiah Maxwell, a physician from Philadelphia who lost his license for treating Apache patients during an outbreak of cholera. He's been working with the network for 3 years now. The medicine show was perfect cover. Traveling performers were expected to be exotic and mysterious, and their wagons were large enough to hide secret compartments. Most importantly, they had legitimate business traveling from town to town, which meant they could pass through checkpoints that would stop other travelers. You and Ingrid will pose as members of the troupe, Dr. Vasquez explained. Your Apache heritage makes you perfect for the role of an Indian medicine man, and Ingrid can be your assistant. The children will be hidden in specially built compartments in the wagon until you reach Santa Fe. As they prepared for the next stage of their journey, Raphael found himself in conversation with Running Deer, the elderly Apache medicine woman. She'd been watching him since they arrived, her ancient eyes reading things in his face that he'd tried to keep hidden. "You carry much anger, grandson," she said in Apache, using the term that marked him as kin, despite their different bands. "Anger at the white soldiers who killed our people, anger at yourself for surviving when others died. But anger without purpose is just poison in the soul." Raphael nodded, recognizing the truth in her words. Since escaping from Copper Canyon, he'd been driven by rage and the need for revenge. But somewhere along the way, his motivation had changed. It wasn't just about punishing Harrison anymore. It was about protecting Ingrid and the children, about making sure their sacrifice had meaning. "Your mother's spirit watches over you," Running Deer continued. "She is proud that you chose to save the innocent rather than simply destroy the guilty. That is the true Apache way, the way of protecting the people." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us now. Back to the story. As night fell over the hidden refuge, Raphael found himself sitting with Ingrid near the central fire pit while the children slept in one of the alcoves. For the first time in days, they were safe enough to actually talk about something other than immediate survival. "Do you regret it?" Raphael asked quietly. "Running away from Blackwood? Getting caught up in all this danger? You could have had a comfortable life as a rancher's wife." Ingrid's laugh was soft but bitter. "Comfortable for who? Not for the children Blackwood planned to sell into slavery. Not for the women he would have beaten into submission. Not for me, watching myself disappear piece by piece until nothing remained but an empty shell, wearing expensive dresses." She looked toward the alcove where Paolo, Marco, and Lucia slept peacefully for the first time in days. "My grandmother used to tell me stories about women in the old country who had to choose between safety and freedom. She said the ones who chose safety always regretted it, but the ones who chose freedom never did, even when it cost them everything." The next morning brought new challenges and new allies. Dr. Maxwell's medicine show arrived at the hidden camp in a convoy of brightly painted wagons that looked like something from a fairy tale. The professor himself was a tall, thin man with wild gray hair and eyes that sparkled with intelligence and mischief. "Dr. Vasquez tells me you need passage to Santa Fe," he said, studying Raphael with professional interest. "I understand you have some experience with military matters. That could be very useful, given the current political situation." As it turned out, the medicine show needed Raphael's expertise as much as he needed their transportation. Word had spread about Harrison's death and the battle at the Stone Maze, and the territory was crawling with patrols looking for the Apache renegades responsible for attacking white settlers. "The story in the newspapers is quite creative," Dr. Maxwell said, showing Raphael a copy of the Santa Fe Register. "According to this, a band of bloodthirsty savages ambushed a peaceful cavalry patrol and murdered several innocent civilians. There's no mention of Blackwood or the conspiracy. Just the usual propaganda about Indian uprisings." Raphael studied the newspaper article, noting how it twisted the facts to serve the interests of the corrupt officials Harrison had been protecting. The truth about the massacre at Copper Canyon, about the weapons smuggling, about Blackwood's crimes against Ingrid and the children, had been buried under a familiar narrative of savage Indians attacking innocent whites. "Which is why getting this evidence to Judge Morrison is so important," Dr. Vasquez said, as she helped Raphael and Ingrid prepare their disguises for the medicine show. "He's one of the few officials in the territory with both the authority and the integrity to investigate this properly." As the medicine show prepared to leave the hidden refuge, Raphael looked back at the ancient cave entrance one last time. This place had saved their lives, but more than that, it had shown him something he'd thought was lost forever. There were still good people in the world, people willing to risk everything to help strangers in need. The journey north would be dangerous, and there was no guarantee they'd reach Santa Fe alive. But for the first time since escaping from Copper Canyon, Raphael felt something that wasn't just grim determination or desperate hope. He felt like they might actually have a chance to win this fight. As the colorful wagons rolled away from the mesa and into the vast expanse of the New Mexico territory, Raphael realized that their story was no longer just about survival. It had become something larger, something that could make a difference for all the people who'd suffered under the kind of corruption and brutality that Harrison and Blackwood represented. Judge Samuel Morrison's courthouse in Santa Fe had been transformed into a fortress, with armed marshals at every entrance and sharpshooters on the rooftops. Because the evidence Raphael and Ingrid carried had sparked the biggest corruption trial in territorial history, and powerful men were willing to kill to stop the truth from coming out. The journey north, with Dr. Maxwell's medicine show, had taken 2 weeks of careful travel through mountain passes and hidden valleys, avoiding the main roads where bounty hunters and corrupt officials might be watching. Raphael had played his role as an Apache medicine man to perfection, while Ingrid had proven surprisingly gifted at the theatrical performances that were their cover. The children had endured the cramped hiding spaces with remarkable courage, emerging only at night when the show was camped in safe locations. But their arrival in Santa Fe had triggered a chain of events that nobody could have anticipated. Judge Morrison had taken one look at the evidence they carried and immediately issued arrest warrants for 12 territorial officials, including 3 Army colonels, 2 Indian agents, and the territorial secretary himself. Within hours, the entire government structure of New Mexico was in chaos. "They're calling it the Santa Fe Conspiracy," Morrison explained as he reviewed the documents and gold coins that proved the weapons smuggling operation. Newspapers from Denver to El Paso are sending reporters. The Secretary of War in Washington has ordered a full investigation. This case is going to decide whether justice exists on the frontier or whether it's just another word for whatever powerful men want it to mean. The trial was set to begin in 3 days, but the defendants weren't going quietly. Cornelius Blackwood had arrived in Santa Fe with an army of lawyers and hired guns, claiming that Ingrid was his legal wife who'd been kidnapped by Apache raiders. The surviving military conspirators were telling anyone who'd listen that Raphael was a deserter and murderer who'd killed Colonel Harrison in cold blood. "The problem is credibility," Morrison's prosecutor district attorney James Welsh explained during a strategy meeting in the judge's chambers. "You're asking a jury of white settlers to believe the word of an Apache scout and a runaway bride against some of the most powerful men in the territory. They'll say you're both criminals with every reason to lie." Raphael understood the challenge they faced. In the eyes of most white settlers, he was little better than the savage Indians they'd come west to escape from. Ingrid was a foreign woman who'd broken a legal marriage contract, which made her testimony automatically suspect. Even the children's statements about Blackwood's plans to sell them into mine labor could be dismissed as coached lies. But Morrison had been preparing for this case longer than any of them realized. For 6 months, he'd been quietly investigating reports of corruption in the territorial government, building a network of informants and gathering evidence. The documents Raphael and Ingrid had brought were the final pieces of a much larger puzzle. "We have bank records showing payments from the territorial treasury to shell companies that don't exist," Morrison said, spreading papers across his desk. "We have bills of lading for weapons shipments that were supposed to go to army posts but ended up in Apache camps. We have testimony from soldiers who were ordered to participate in raids against peaceful villages and then told to keep quiet about what they'd seen. More importantly, they had unexpected allies. Thomas Hartley, the army clerk who discovered the weapons smuggling, had kept copies of all the incriminating documents before fleeing for his life. Maria Santos, the Mexican woman who'd escaped from a forced marriage, had been married to one of Blackwood's lieutenants and knew details about his business operations. James Crawford, the freed slave making his way to California, had witnessed Army units selling weapons to Confederate sympathizers during the war. The Esperanza Network has been documenting these crimes for years, Dr. Vasquez explained, as she arrived in Santa Fe with a wagon full of additional evidence. Every person we've helped escape has brought us pieces of the story. Individually, their testimonies might not be enough. Together, they paint a picture of systematic corruption that goes back to the beginning of the territorial period. The defense strategy became clear during jury selection. Blackwood's lawyers were determined to turn the trial into a referendum on race and civilization, portraying their clients as upstanding citizens defending white society against savage Indians and ungrateful foreigners. They challenged every potential Mexican or Apache juror, leaving a panel of 12 white men who'd all lost family members or property to Indian raids. They're going to claim this is all an Apache plot to destroy white civilization, Welsh warned Raphael as they prepared for the opening statements. They'll say you're using this trial to get revenge for legitimate military actions against hostile Indians. The jury will want to believe that narrative because it makes them feel better about taking this land from its original inhabitants. Raphael nodded grimly. He'd expected this strategy from the moment they decided to seek justice through the white man's courts. But he'd also learned something important during their journey to Santa Fe. Truth had a power that went beyond race or politics, and there were white people willing to listen if the evidence was strong enough. The trial began on a cold January morning with the courthouse packed to capacity. Reporters from major newspapers filled the front rows, while curious citizens and officials from across the territory crowded into every available seat. Outside, crowds gathered in the plaza to hear updates from the proceedings. District Attorney Welsh opened with a simple but powerful statement that laid out the prosecution's case in terms any jury could understand. Gentlemen of the jury, this trial is about whether the law applies equally to all men or whether some men are above the law because of their wealth and position. The evidence will show that the defendants used their official positions to commit murder, theft, slavery, and treason against the United States government. The defense response was exactly what Raphael had expected. Blackwood's lead attorney, a silver-haired man named Harrison Caldwell, who'd been imported from Denver specifically for this trial, painted a picture of innocent officials trying to maintain order in a savage wilderness. These defendants are patriots who've risked their lives to protect civilization on the frontier, Caldwell declared. They're being persecuted by criminals and malcontents who seek to destroy everything decent Americans have built in this territory. The so-called evidence against them was obtained through murder, theft, and kidnapping by Apache renegades and their accomplices. But the prosecution had prepared carefully for this line of attack. Their first witness was Dr. Jeremiah Maxwell, whose medical credentials and distinguished appearance made him a credible narrator for the complex story they needed to tell. "I have treated victims of the conspiracy the defendants operated," Maxwell testified. Apache families whose villages were burned after they'd been sold weapons by the same army units that attacked them. Mexican settlers whose land was seized after they refused to pay protection money to territorial officials. Women and children sold into labor contracts that were indistinguishable from slavery. The defense tried to discredit Maxwell by revealing his association with the Esperanza Network. But their attacks backfired when he calmly explained why he'd devoted his life to helping refugees. "I took an oath as a physician to do no harm," Maxwell said. "When I discovered that my own government was systematically harming innocent people for profit, I had a choice. I could remain silent and complicit, or I could act according to my conscience. I chose conscience." The testimony that followed built a devastating case against the defendants. Bank records showed money flowing from territorial accounts to private businesses owned by the conspirators. Military documents revealed orders to attack specific Apache bands immediately after those same bands had purchased weapons from army suppliers. Personal letters discussed the profits to be made from Indian troubles and the need to eliminate witnesses. But it was Ingrid's testimony that transformed the trial from a political proceeding into something deeply personal. Dressed in a simple blue dress that emphasized her dignity rather than her beauty, she spoke quietly but clearly about her experience with Cornelius Blackwood. "He told me that I belonged to him like his cattle or his horses," she said, her Italian accent making her words more poignant rather than less credible. "When I objected to his plans for the children, he struck me and said that foreign women needed to learn their place in America. He said the children would work in his mines until they died or proved useful in other ways." The defense tried to attack her character by pointing out that she'd broken a legal marriage contract. But Ingrid's response silenced the courtroom. "In my country we have a saying," she said. "A contract signed with the devil is not binding in the eyes of God. I signed no contract to become a slave or to deliver innocent children into slavery. If American law says otherwise, then American law is wrong." When Raphael finally took the stand, the courtroom tension was palpable. This was the moment the defense had been preparing for, their chance to destroy the prosecution's case by discrediting its star witness. Caldwell began his cross-examination with the kind of racial hostility that usually worked with territorial juries. "You're a half-breed Apache who served in the army but betrayed his oath when it suited your purposes," Caldwell declared. "Why should this jury believe anything you say about civilized men?" Raphael had spent 2 weeks preparing for this moment, but when it came, his response was pure instinct. "Because I've lived in both worlds, and I've seen what civilized men do when they think nobody's watching. I've seen them murder children and call it military necessity. I've seen them sell weapons to their enemies and then use those weapons as justification for genocide. If that's civilization, then maybe it's time for something better." The cross-examination continued for hours, with Caldwell trying every possible angle to discredit Raphael's testimony. But each attack only made Raphael's responses more powerful, as he calmly described what he'd witnessed at Copper Canyon and during their flight across the territory. "You claim Colonel Harrison ordered the massacre of peaceful Apache," Caldwell said during one exchange. "But weren't those Indians armed with weapons they'd stolen from the army?" "Bah, they were armed with weapons the army had sold them," Raphael corrected. "I have the receipts in Colonel Harrison's own handwriting. He sold them rifles on Monday and used those same rifles as evidence to justify killing them on Wednesday. It was very efficient." The most dramatic moment came when Paolo, Marco, and little Lucia took the stand together. Judge Morrison had initially ruled that the children were too young to testify, but Welsh had argued that their testimony was essential to proving Blackwood's intent to engage in slavery. "The bad man said we would work in the dark places underground," Paolo testified, his 8-year-old voice carrying clearly through the silent courtroom. "He said if we worked hard and didn't cause trouble, maybe we would live long enough to be useful. He said Ingrid would make him sons, and if she made daughters, he would sell them when they got old enough." The defense's attempts to discredit the children's testimony backfired spectacularly when Caldwell suggested that they'd been coached by Raphael and Ingrid. "Nobody taught us to remember being scared," little Lucia said, clutching her cornhusk doll. "Nobody taught us to remember being hungry. The bad man made us remember by being bad." As the trial entered its final phase, it became clear that the prosecution had built an overwhelming case. The evidence of corruption was undeniable. The witness testimony was consistent and credible, and even the defense's racial appeals were falling flat with a jury that had heard too much truth to ignore it. But powerful men don't surrender easily, and Cornelius Blackwood had one final card to play. On the last night before closing arguments, gunmen attacked the hotel where Raphael and Ingrid were staying under protective custody. The assault was repelled by federal marshals, but the message was clear. The conspiracy would rather risk everything than accept defeat. "They're desperate," Judge Morrison observed as he surveyed the bullet holes in the hotel walls, "which makes them more dangerous than ever." But it also proves that everything you've testified to is true. Innocent men don't hire assassins to silence their accusers. As the jury began their deliberations, Raphael found himself thinking about his cousin Joaquin, who died fighting Harrison's mercenaries at the Stone Maze, about Chief Running Bear and all the Apache who'd been murdered at Copper Canyon, about the countless victims of the conspiracy who'd never lived to see justice. The verdict, when it came, would determine whether their sacrifices had meant something or whether corruption and violence would continue to rule the frontier. But regardless of what 12 white men decided in that courthouse, Raphael knew that the real victory had already been won. The truth had been told, witnesses had been heard, and the conspiracy that had seemed untouchable had been dragged into the light. Whatever happened next, the world would never be quite the same. The jury's verdict of guilty on all charges against Cornelius Blackwood and his conspirators had made headlines from Washington to California. But it was the wedding ceremony taking place 2 years later in the rebuilt Apache village of Esperanza that truly proved justice could triumph over hatred in the American West. Raphael stood beneath an arch of desert wildflowers and Apache prayer feathers, wearing a mixture of traditional Apache wedding garments and a white man's dress shirt that Ingrid had embroidered with symbols from both their cultures. His hair was braided with red ribbons that matched the crimson hawk feather his mother had given him, and around his neck hung a silver cross that had belonged to Ingrid's grandmother in Italy. Beside him, Ingrid looked radiant in a wedding dress that told the story of their journey together. The white silk had been sewn by Apache women using traditional patterns, while the lace veil had been a gift from Dr. Elena Vasquez of the Esperanza Network. The bouquet in her hands contained flowers from 3 different worlds: Italian roses that Father Miguel had somehow managed to grow in the desert, Apache sacred sage, and Mexican marigolds that symbolized the triumph of life over death. The wedding guests represented the new world they'd helped create through their courage and testimony. Judge Samuel Morrison stood beside Dr. Jeremiah Maxwell, both men having become close friends during the 2 years of legal battles that had followed the conspiracy trial. Maria Santos sat with James Crawford and his daughters, all of them now successful business owners in the growing town of Esperanza. Thomas Hartley, the former army clerk whose testimony had been crucial to the prosecutions, had become the town's first schoolteacher, but it was the presence of Paolo, Marco, and little Lucia that made this wedding truly special. The children Raphael and Ingrid had saved from Cornelius Blackwood's slavery were now healthy, educated, and part of a family that had chosen love over the accidents of blood and race. Paolo, now 10 years old, served as Raphael's best man, with the solemn dignity of someone who'd grown up too fast, but still remembered how to smile. Marco and Lucia scattered flower petals with the joy of children who'd learned that the world could be beautiful as well as dangerous. The ceremony itself was conducted by Father Miguel, the priest who'd first connected them to the Esperanza Network. But the words spoken came from 3 different traditions: Apache prayers for harmony between all living things, Catholic vows of devotion and fidelity, and Italian blessings for prosperity and many children. It was a wedding that could only have taken place in this specific time and place, where different cultures had learned to respect each other's wisdom. Today we witness not just the union of 2 hearts, Father Miguel said as he blessed their rings, but the birth of a new kind of family, one based not on the color of skin or the accident of birthplace, but on the choice to stand together against injustice and to protect those who cannot protect themselves. As Raphael slipped the wedding ring onto Ingrid's finger, he thought about the journey that had brought them to this moment. The massacre at Copper Canyon seemed like a lifetime ago, but he still carried the memories of that day and the responsibility to honor the dead by building something better for the living. The conspiracy trial had ended with 12 convictions and prison sentences that would keep dangerous men locked away for decades. But more importantly, it had changed how people thought about justice in the territories. The reception that followed was held in the central plaza of Esperanza, a town that had grown from a simple mission into a thriving community where Apache, Mexican and American families lived and worked together as equals. The buildings were adobe in the Mexican style, but decorated with Apache symbols and flying American flags that actually meant something about freedom and justice, rather than conquest and oppression. Dr. Elena Vasquez had traveled from her new clinic in Albuquerque to attend the wedding, bringing with her news of how the Esperanza network had expanded throughout the Southwest. "We now have safe houses in 12 territories," she reported during her toast to the bride and groom. "Last year alone, we helped over 300 people escape from situations where the law could not protect them. None of it would have been possible without the courage you two showed in bringing the Santa Fe conspiracy to light." The transformation had gone far beyond the network's activities. The corruption trial had led to a complete reorganization of territorial government, with new oversight mechanisms and accountability measures that made it much harder for officials to abuse their positions. The army had implemented new protocols for dealing with Indian tribes, emphasizing negotiation and fair treatment over military force. Most importantly, newspapers throughout the West had begun investigating other cases of corruption and abuse, creating a climate where victims felt safe coming forward. But perhaps the most significant change was happening right here in Esperanza, where the wedding celebration continued late into the night with music and dancing that blended traditions from 3 different cultures. Apache drums provided the rhythm while Mexican guitars added melody, and Paolo had somehow learned to play Italian folk songs on a harmonica that James Crawford had given him. It was the sound of a new America being born, one that honored its diverse heritage instead of trying to erase it. As the evening progressed, Raphael found himself in conversation with Running Deer, the elderly Apache medicine woman who'd become something of a grandmother figure to the entire community. At 93, she was one of the last living links to the time before white settlement. But she'd embraced the changes happening in Esperanza with the wisdom of someone who understood that survival sometimes required adaptation. "Your mother's spirit is happy tonight, grandson," she said in Apache, watching Ingrid dance with little Lucia while Marco and Paolo tried to keep up with the complicated steps. "She sees that you chose to build rather than simply destroy, to create new life rather than just avenge old deaths. That is the true victory over those who would have destroyed us all." Raphael nodded, understanding the deeper meaning in her words. The Apache way had always been about more than just warfare and resistance. It was about maintaining the balance between all living things, about protecting the innocent, and ensuring that life continued even in the face of terrible losses. By saving Ingrid and the children, by choosing to seek justice rather than simple revenge, he'd honored the deepest teachings of his mother's people. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of an unexpected guest. Judge Morrison approached with a telegram in his hand and an expression that mixed excitement with concern. "This just arrived from Washington," he said, handing Raphael the official document. "The President has signed the Indian Rights Act into law, based largely on the evidence from our trial. It establishes legal protections for native peoples and creates a new Bureau of Indian Affairs with genuine oversight responsibilities." Raphael read the telegram with growing amazement. The law wasn't perfect, and it wouldn't undo centuries of injustice, but it represented a fundamental shift in how the federal government approached relations with Indian tribes. Instead of policies based purely on military force and land seizure, there would now be legal frameworks that recognized native peoples as human beings with rights that had to be respected. "There's more," Morrison continued. "The President has also authorized the creation of territorial integration programs designed to help different ethnic communities work together rather than fight each other. They want to use Esperanza as a model for other settlements throughout the West." As the implications of this news sank in, Raphael realized that their personal victory had become something much larger. The story of an Apache scout who'd saved a runaway bride and 3 orphaned children had somehow sparked a transformation in American policy toward the very issues that had nearly destroyed them all. But the celebration was interrupted by one final reminder that the past wasn't completely buried. Cornelius Blackwood's younger brother Marcus had arrived in Esperanza that very day, accompanied by 2 lawyers and a federal marshal. He was challenging the verdicts from the conspiracy trial, claiming new evidence that would exonerate his dead brother and restore the family's confiscated property. "He's within his legal rights," Morrison explained as they gathered in his temporary office to discuss this development. "The appeals process allows for new evidence to be presented if it becomes available. We'll have to respond to his claims in court." Raphael felt the familiar tightness in his chest that had haunted him during the original trial. Just when it seemed like justice had been achieved, like they could finally build their new life in peace, the ghosts of the past were rising to threaten everything they'd accomplished. But Ingrid surprised everyone with her response. Instead of fear or anger, she showed the same calm determination that had sustained her through their original ordeal. "Then we go to court again," she said simply. "We tell the truth again, as many times as necessary until it finally stays told." Her words reminded Raphael of something Running Deer had taught him about Apache warfare. The true warriors weren't the ones who won a single battle, but the ones who kept fighting until peace could be secured for future generations. The struggle for justice wasn't something that ended with one trial or one victory. It was an ongoing commitment that required constant vigilance and renewed courage. The legal challenge from Marcus Blackwood turned out to be based on forged documents and perjured testimony, exposed within a week by the same investigative methods that had originally brought down the conspiracy. But the attempt itself served an important purpose, reminding everyone in Esperanza that the forces of corruption and hatred were still active and still dangerous. "Which is why what you're building here is so important," Dr. Maxwell observed during a community meeting called to discuss security measures. "Esperanza isn't just a place where different people live together peacefully. It's proof that American ideals of freedom and justice can actually work when people are willing to fight for them." As winter gave way to spring in their first year of marriage, Raphael and Ingrid settled into the rhythm of daily life in a community that was constantly growing and changing. Raphael had been appointed as the territorial liaison for Indian affairs, a position that required him to travel throughout the Southwest, helping other communities develop the kind of cooperative relationships that made Esperanza successful. Ingrid had opened a school that taught children from all ethnic backgrounds together, using teaching methods that honored different cultural traditions while preparing students for success in the modern world. Paulo, Marco, and Lucia were among her first students, but they were soon joined by Apache, Mexican, and American children whose parents recognized the value of education that went beyond simple prejudice. The most remarkable thing about their new life was how normal it felt. After everything they'd endured together, the daily routines of marriage and family and community work seemed almost anticlimactic. But Raphael had learned that the quiet victories were often the most important ones. Every day that passed without violence, every child who learned to read, every family that found safety and prosperity in Esperanza was a testament to the power of choosing hope over hatred. One evening, as they sat on the porch of their adobe house watching Paolo teach Marco and Lucia to ride horses in the corral behind their home, Ingrid placed her hand over her growing belly and smiled at the secret they'd been keeping for the past month. "So, I think our child will be born into a better world than either of us knew growing up," she said softly. "Not a perfect world, but one where justice is possible and where people can choose to be better than their worst impulses." Raphael took her hand, feeling the life growing inside her and thinking about the future they were creating together. Their child would be born into a world where an Apache father and an Italian mother could raise their family in peace, where 3 orphaned children could find love and security regardless of their origins, where truth could triumph over lies and justice could overcome corruption. As the sun set over the mountains surrounding Esperanza, painting the desert sky in shades of gold and crimson, Raphael reflected on the strange journey that had brought them to this moment. He'd started as a man running from death and betrayal, carrying nothing but anger and the bitter taste of loss. But somewhere along the way, he discovered that the greatest victory wasn't defeating your enemies. It was saving the innocent, protecting the defenseless, and building something beautiful from the ruins of what had been destroyed. The story that had begun with an Apache rider escaping a blood raid and finding a starving bride fighting to shield 3 orphans had become something none of them could have imagined. It had become proof that love could triumph over hatred, that justice could overcome corruption, and that ordinary people could change the world when they chose courage over safety. And as the first stars appeared in the clear desert sky, Raphael knew that this ending was really just another beginning. 10 years after an Apache rider escaped a blood raid and found a starving bride fighting to shield 3 orphans, the children they had saved stood before a crowd of territorial dignitaries, announcing the opening of the Esperanza Academy for Young Leaders, proving that the seeds of courage could grow into institutions that changed the world. Paolo Marchetti, now 18 years old, embodied everything Raphael and Ingrid had hoped for when they first rescued him from the wolves in that desert clearing. His voice was confident and clear as it carried across the academy's courtyard, proving how far their family had traveled from those dark moments of running and hiding. "We gathered today not just to open a school," Paolo said, looking out over a crowd that included Apache chiefs, Mexican dignitaries, and territorial officials, but to honor the courage of those who saved us when we had nowhere else to turn. They showed us that family isn't about blood or birthplace, but about the choice to stand together when the world tries to tear you apart. Behind him on the platform, Raphael Redfeather sat beside his wife Ingrid, their faces glowing with pride as they watched the boy they'd saved grow into a leader. Raphael wore his finest Apache ceremonial shirt, while Ingrid's dress combined the elegance of her Italian heritage with southwestern craftsmanship. Between them sat their 5-year-old daughter Elena and 2-year-old son Miguel, both children representing the new generation that would inherit the world their parents had fought to create. Marco stepped forward next, now 16 and tall for his age, addressing the crowd in 3 languages. In Spanish, we say, "La familia es todo," family is everything. In Apache, Raphael taught us "Shiche da sida," which means we are all related. In English, we simply say that love makes us stronger than hate. This academy will teach all 3 truths to every child who walks through these doors. Little Lucia, now 14 and carrying a leather-bound journal, where she recorded the stories of everyone in Esperanza, spoke last. "When I was small and afraid, Ingrid told me that every ending could become a new beginning if we were brave enough to write the next chapter. Today we write the beginning of a story that will last long after all of us are gone." The ceremony continued with speeches from officials who had once been enemies of everything Esperanza represented. Governor Harrison Webb spoke about how the community had become a model for peaceful coexistence throughout the Southwest. What began as one man's courage in saving 1 woman and 3 children has grown into proof that American ideals of freedom and justice can work for everyone, not just the powerful few. Dr. Elena Vasquez, now in her 60s, but still running the expanded Esperanza network, delivered remarks about how the organization had helped over 2,000 people escape from dangerous situations in the past decade. "Every person we've saved has gone on to build something beautiful in the world," she said. "But none of it would have been possible without the example Raphael and Ingrid set when they chose to stand against injustice even when it seemed hopeless." The most moving moment came when Running Deer, now 98 and one of the last living connections to the pre-settlement Apache way of life, offered a blessing that combined traditional prayers with hopes for the future. Speaking in Apache while Paolo translated, she said, "The spirits of all who died for this land are watching today. They see that their sacrifices were not in vain, that their children and grandchildren will live in a world where different peoples can share the same sky without shedding each other's blood." As evening fell over Esperanza, the extended family gathered in the courtyard of Raphael and Ingrid's home for their traditional storytelling after important events. The story had evolved into something of a legend in Esperanza, with each telling emphasizing different lessons about courage, justice, and the power of choosing love over hatred. The storytelling began as it always did, with Raphael describing the massacre at Copper Canyon and his desperate flight across the desert. Each family member added their own perspective and memories. Ingrid spoke about the terror of facing the wolves alone, and the moment she realized that the painted warrior approaching her was salvation rather than another threat. Paolo remembered the weight of responsibility he'd felt even at 8 years old, knowing that his little brother and sister depended on him to be brave. Marco talked about learning to trust again after losing his parents, while Lucia shared her memories of how Raphael's gentle voice had made her feel safe even in the middle of their most dangerous moments. But it was young Elena who asked the question that surprised everyone. "Papa, why did the bad men want to hurt people who were different from them? Why couldn't they just be friends like we are?" Raphael exchanged glances with Ingrid, both recognizing that their daughter had touched on the heart of everything they'd fought against and everything they'd tried to build. "Sometimes, Mija," Raphael said gently, "people become afraid of things they don't understand. And when people are afraid, they sometimes hurt others instead of trying to learn about them. That's why places like our academy are so important. When children grow up learning together, they don't become afraid of each other." The next morning brought visitors that reminded everyone how far their influence had spread. A delegation from the territorial capital arrived with news that Esperanza's model of integrated education was being studied by officials in Washington as a possible template for federal Indian policy. "The President has asked for a detailed report on how your community has achieved such remarkable success in bringing different ethnic groups together," announced Territorial Secretary William Barnes. "There's serious discussion about establishing similar communities throughout the West. The recognition was gratifying, but it also brought new challenges. Success had made Esperanza a symbol of what was possible, but symbols could become targets for those who preferred the old ways of hatred and division. We've received reports of organized opposition to the integration policies," Barnes warned. "There are groups forming in several territories specifically to prevent the spread of what they call the Esperanza infection. You may face increased pressure and even direct attacks in the coming months." Raphael nodded grimly, recognizing that the battle for justice was never truly finished. Each victory created new challenges, and each generation had to choose whether to defend the progress their parents had made or allow it to slip away through complacency and fear. But as he looked around at the community they'd built, at the children playing together regardless of their heritage, at the academy, where the next generation of leaders was being educated in the values of cooperation and mutual respect, Raphael felt confident that the foundation they'd laid was strong enough to withstand whatever storms might come. That evening, as Raphael and Ingrid sat on their porch watching the sunset paint the desert sky in shades of gold and crimson, they reflected on the strange journey that had brought them from desperation to contentment, from running for their lives to building something that would outlast their own mortality. "Do you think we've done enough?" Ingrid asked, her hand resting in Raphael's as it had through 10 years of marriage. "Have we built something that will survive when we're no longer here to protect it?" Raphael considered the question as he watched Paolo teaching a group of younger children how to care for horses, using both Apache and Italian methods he'd learned from his adoptive parents. Marco was visible through the academy's windows, working late on lesson plans for his mathematics classes. Lucia was interviewing Mrs. Crawford for the oral history project that was preserving the stories of everyone who'd helped build Esperanza. "We've planted seeds," Raphael said finally. "Good seeds in fertile ground, tended by people who understand their value. What grows from those seeds will depend on choices our children and grandchildren make, but we've given them the best foundation we could." As the first stars appeared in the clear desert sky, Raphael thought about his Apache mother, who had died believing that her people faced extinction, and his Mexican father, who had fled across the border to escape the violence that seemed inevitable between cultures. Neither of them could have imagined a world where their son would help create a community where such divisions seemed not just unnecessary, but absurd. The story that had begun with blood and terror, with a desperate bride shielding 3 orphan children from wolves in the middle of nowhere, had become something larger than any of them had dared to hope. It had become proof that ordinary people could change the world when they chose courage over safety, love over hatred, hope over despair. And as the desert wind carried the sound of children's laughter and adults' conversations in 3 different languages, Raphael knew that the best chapters of their story were still being written. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.